Welcome to another one of my Latin videos. Today we'll be talking about some Latin that is relevant for the paper that I'm writing this semester and that I'm going to be presenting on February 11th. That's why I'm going ahead and looking at some of these primary sources before the semester starts to kind of get things ready for that presentation. So if you've seen some of my other videos, you might know what my paper roughly is about. But basically, one of the arguments I'm making is that this city, Cordoba, which is located in modern Spain, was actually independent for around 100 years rather than the traditional viewpoint that it was only independent for about 20 years during this period of rebellion against the Visigoths, who were supposedly ruling the entirety of Spain in the 6th century when this rebellion was supposed to have taken place. So my argument is that they were actually an independent city from about the mid-5th century up through the time of this so-called rebellion until they were finally conquered again in 572 by the Visigoths. So if my argument is that there wasn't really a rebellion, I need to look at the sources and kind of confirm that. So I've already based that kind of idea off of reading secondary sources and other scholars' arguments about the situation there in Spain in the 6th century, but you can't just read all the secondary sources and just leave it at that. You need to look at the documents from the earlier time periods, and one of the documents that I'm going to be looking at today in order to kind of double check my ideas based on the secondary sources and also perhaps build on my ideas and find more in the primary sources that support them is a source by Isidore of Seville called the Chronicon Maiora. So this is just a chronicle, which if you know what a chronicle is, it's pretty similar to history, except for instead of kind of a long narrative, most of the time it'll just be a date and then what happened. So this, if you are in school, this might be like a timeline sort of with sentences associated with each date. That's kind of what's going on here. And Isidore of Seville was a person who was part of the Visigothic kingdom in the 6th into the 7th century. So most of his writing comes from the 7th century. And he lived from 560 to 636. So Isidore wrote many other things besides the Chronicon Maiora. He wrote some histories that I will probably do a video about later, as well as studying religion. He was involved in the church, in the Christian church during that time period. And as a bishop, he also studied lots of other things. He wrote kind of more encyclopedic works as well. But today we're focusing on the Chronicon Maiora, which there was actually two different versions. So the first version was from around 615 to 616. And then he kind of did an updated version later in 626, or a kind of revised version. So we're going to be looking at both versions. And kind of the point of this is that he has one entry in the Chronicle that is directly relevant to the situation of Cordoba in Spain. So I'll go ahead and read that quote in Latin, and then I'll read an English translation by the scholars Jamie Wood and Sam Kuhn. But here's the quote in Latin. Hoc tempestate Leuwigildus rex Gothorum quastam Spaniae regione sibi rebelles in potestatem sui regni superando redigit. So, aside from perhaps mispronouncing some of those Latin, that was the entry that was in the Chronicle. We'll now read the English translation. At this time, Leovigild, king of the Goths, by conquering certain rebellious regions of Spain for himself, rendered them into the power of his kingdom. So, even though Cordoba is not directly mentioned, this is usually one of those rebellious regions that's talked about. So among other areas in Spain also, there was different groups who were not following the Visigothic kingdom's lead or trying to break away from it within Spain. And so this king, Leovigild, was able to kind of conquer all of these different areas and kind of unify the Spanish peninsula almost entirely underneath the Visigothic rule. All right, so when we look at this specific sentence, there was a few different words that I wanted to focus on in order to understand what was really going on and what was really trying to be communicated. So the best way to do that is, if you're not sure what a word means in the context of a certain text in ancient times, because different authors use the same word slightly differently. This happens all the time just in our modern usage, just in English even, where people kind of will be saying the same thing, but they don't mean the same thing. It can often be very confusing. But I picked 3 words that I focused on from this quote. So rebeles, which just means rebel, or it can mean a few other things along that lines. So that was the first word that I decided to focus on. And when I studied this, I looked up using the Library of Latin Texts resource online. I was able to compare all the different entries within the Chronicle and find where this word was used and what kind of context it was used in. So the only places besides the entry that I just read you, which by the way is only found in the first version, not the revised version of the Chronicle, it's the only other times it's used are the Jewish rebellions against Hadrian in the 2nd century, and then it was also used again for the 3rd century during a time when the Persians and Parthians were fighting a war against the Romans. So this is interesting context for this particular word because it does support kind of my argument, I would say, because rather than it necessarily meaning rebels were people who were under a government and then were trying to fight back against that government, it seems to mean that it could just be applying to a group who was perhaps breaking a treaty rather than rebelling, or in the sense that we think of usually in English, or that doesn't necessarily imply that the people who are doing the rebellion were under the explicit dominion of the people they were rebelling against. So for example, the Parthians and the Persians were an entirely separate empire from the Romans, even though elsewhere in the Chronicle it says that the Parthians and the Persians, when they were rebelling, fought against the Romans. So here it wouldn't make any sense for it to be a rebel in the sense of a particular region or city that is under a government then fighting back against that government. Again, with the Jews, it seems like it could be, again, like a breach of a treaty or something like that if they had reached an agreement with the government. So I can interpret this to mean that some of these areas, at least in Spain, were not necessarily already under the Visigoths before they rebelled and had to be reconquered. It could indicate that they were under them in kind of by treaty, not necessarily by being officially part of the kingdom, but just more like allies, lesser allies of the kingdom. The next word that I looked at was superando in the sentence, which is the word that has to do with, in the English translation, when it talks about the king conquering. When I looked up the rest of the references or uses of the word superando or similar words of the same, just conjugated differently, for example, there was 9 uses between the 2 different versions of the text, and there wasn't anything that was super clear that added more context beyond just conquering. So even though I looked up this word, it wasn't super useful to kind of do a close study of how this word was used throughout the Chronicle, but that's still an important finding. It's always good to present your findings, even if they don't have a conclusive character to them, because that will still strengthen your argument to say, well, at least I looked at it from this perspective, but this particular word doesn't seem to be talking about anything beyond just kind of a generic sense of conquering. The last word that I looked up in detail and tried to cross-reference for the Chronicon Maiora source was redigit, which was the main verb of the sentence and is the one that was saying that the rebellious regions were brought back into the power of the kingdom of Leovigild. So in the English that I read, it was rendered them into the power of his kingdom. So this verb is a little tricky, but it comes basically from the very common Latin verb ago with red as a prefix or re as a prefix, and then they put the extra d in there to make it more readable. And this kind of has the idea of driving someone into a place, like pushing them or forcing them into a certain situation. And the re kind of means back, so it can mean drive them back, push them back. It could mean bring back, which would make sense if we were considering this to be a rebellion, but that doesn't seem to be the most common usage of the phrase. And though this particular verb is not used anywhere else in the Chronicon, there are other verbs that can also mean to take back land or to restore land, and these are also used in different places. So it seems that it doesn't have this idea, or isn't likely to have the idea of these rebellious regions necessarily being brought back into the kingdom, as in they had recently escaped from or become independent from the kingdom. It kind of seems to have more this idea just of their forces were driven back and they were kind of, again, conquered. And this seems to be at least a very plausible reading of this sentence. So that was kind of my conclusion, is that while the description in the Chronica Maiora definitely does not show with any certainty that the city of Cordoba and these other rebellious regions had not been involved in the Visigothic kingdom prior to them being conquered by Leovigild, it definitely doesn't say with any assurance that they had been part of the kingdom before their rebellion. And so here, rebellion probably means more like defiance or breaking a treaty, something along those lines, rather than necessarily meaning that they had been part of the same political unit of the Visigothic kingdom prior to them being reconquered or just conquered for the first time by this king of the Goths, Leovigild. So that is kind of the summary of what I have gleaned from just this particular sentence in the Chronicon Maiora of Isidore of Seville by looking at the usage of particular words in Latin. Thanks for your time, and hopefully this kind of gives you a sense of the type of particular study that I am doing of these Latin words and kind of comparing their usage, other words that can also mean the same thing, and how those are used in a particular document in order to build some of my arguments about Cordoba in the late antique period of the 5th and 6th centuries. Thanks. And he are with the Jewish rebellions against Hadrian in the later Jewish rebellions against Hadrian. That would have been the 2nd century. And then the last word that I looked at from this sentence was the main verb of the sentence, redigit or redigit. And this is from red ego. So ego is a very common verb in Latin. also in the church, the Christian church at that time, and